We're delighted to see all of you. I'm Masha Belenky. I wanted to thank my co-hosts, Rachel Mesch and Susan McCready, for making this book dialogue series possible. And thank you, all of you, for coming. Today, I'm so excited to introduce my good friend, Susan Hiner, who will be discussing her new fabulous book. Susan Hiner is a professor of French and Francophone studies at Vassar College, where she also directs the program in Global 19th Century Studies and serves as the faculty director of research development. Her first book, Accessories to Modernity, Fashion and the Feminine in 19th Century France, won the Milia Davenport Publication Award of the Costume Society of America in June 2011. Her most recent book, the one we're discussing today, Behind the Seams, Women, Fashion, and Work in 19th Century France, was published in October 2023 by Bloomsbury Academic. The book was supported by a visiting fellowship at the American Library in Paris and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Susan has published widely on fashion in 19th century France, and most recently, she guest edited a special issue of the journal 19 on soft fashion. Heidi Brevik-Zender is Associate Professor of French and Vice Chair of the Department of Comparative Literature and Languages at the University of California, Riverside. Author of the book Fashioning Spaces, Mode and Modernity in Late 19th Century Paris, and editor of the volume Fashion, Modernity, and Materiality in France, from Rousseau to Art Deco. She has published widely on fashion in French and Francophone context and beyond, including her most recent article, which examines abusive labor practices of the American apparel industry in literature of French-speaking Africa.
All right, well, first let me extend my thanks, especially to Masha, Rachel, and Susan for organizing this series and keeping it going, and also to all of you for showing up today on what's, I'm presuming, the first week of classes for some of you. It is for me, and on a snow day too. I also want to thank Heidi so much for showing up today in and for agreeing to join me today, and for having been such an amazing interlocutor for so long. It was Heidi's invitation to a symposium she organized in Brittany way back in 2015 that led to one of my first publications related to this project. So I'm extra grateful to her. So today I'll give you a brief overview of the book, which was published in October, as Masha said, and the flyer, I did pop the flyer into the chat, and I think Rachel sent indication about that. And then in my conversation with Heidi, I'm sure we'll talk about the process of the book and go more deeply into some of its themes and claims and move to any questions that you might have. So to begin, it's now well established that 19th century French fashion was the powerhouse of the Parisian economy and the launching pad of high fashion embodied in the male couturier of the mid-19th century, who supposedly made fashion what it is today. But my book begins earlier in the 19th century and aims to recover what I view as the invisible thread of women's labor in the early French fashion industry, which has been understudied, unseen, and in many respects unarchived. So let me clarify what I mean by the terms of my title, and I'll get to the seams in a minute. But first, the women. Which women? Well, it's not just the makers of fashion that interest me, although I do work on modistes, the so-called aristocrats of fashion workers. I also study the entrepreneurial marketing work of fashion columnists and editors, and the skilled creative work of fashion illustrators, the makers of fashion plates. I try to get at the intersection of making, writing, and illustrating where the fashion system was built. By fashion, then, I'm talking about fashion in its broadest sense, not just the clothes, but the intersecting networks mostly created and operated by women who were often overshadowed by the couturier who became the face of French fashion for over a century, with a few exceptions. Now, regarding the metaphor of seams, it began with two dresses, one literary and one material. The literary dress was imagined by Balzac, and my thinking about it grew from an observation I had when writing my first book. In Accessories to Modernity, I focused on the femme comme il faut, a specifically 19th century figure whose mission was to incarnate the principles of feminine respectability, mostly through her clever deployment of fashion signals, in particular, the seamlessness of her attire. According to Balzac, the less respectable the lady, the more visible her dress seams, and the more visible anything seamy those poorly sewn seams might reveal. A well-sewn dress, practically a second skin, denoted the seamless elegance of respectability. The literal seaming of a dress thus expressed both social and moral distinctions. The pins and hooks, thread and stitches holding together the elaborate garment were artfully concealed under yards of lace, silk, velvet, or wool. The idea, then, is that the social construction of femininity hid behind a similar ideal of seamlessness, leaving the impression that effortless elegance was innate and natural. The other dress, as I mentioned, was material. At Vassar, and I always have to mention this, we have a historic costume collection, and because of the work I do around fashion and 19th century novels, I frequently bring my students to the costume collection to look at dresses and accessories from the period to try to get a sense of what these garments really looked like and what fictional women, Emma Bovary or the shoppers from Zola's Au Bonheur des Dames, for example, were eager to wear. They sometimes get to try on reproductions, complete with corsets and crinolines, which gives them a sense of what it felt like to move through the world as a bourgeois woman or man in the 19th century. Our conservationists always take the time to talk about dress construction, and it was in looking at the insides of these dresses that I started to think about the hidden work of fashion production in relation to my other questions. So with this book, I wanted to return to the metaphor of seams, only now as it concerns those women on the production side of the 19th century fashion economy. And there goes a snowplow. I wanted to think about the whole of production, not just making garments, because women were not just sewing and fashion is not just clothes, but they were also writing, marketing, illustrating, and interacting with each other to create the fashion system. A seam is a sign of work that, when done skillfully, often conceals itself. In fact, the seam was a sign of specifically female work. Historically, prior to the 19th century, only male tailors had the legal right to cut expensive fabric, and it was the seamstresses, the couturières, frequently tailors' wives and daughters, who assembled the pieces of cut cloth, sewing them together to create and usually conceal the joining seam. Going behind the seams then meant shifting my focus from the seamless woman consumer, the femme comme il faut, to the women who produced the seamless effect, and who were so often obscured by their own glorious products. I focus on three groups of women, mostly working class and bourgeois, who led relatively invisible lives, while the commodities they created achieved hypervisibility. Fashion's success depended on women's expert manipulation of its raw materials. The delicate fingerwork of seamstresses and modistes yielded elegant dresses and ethereal hats, which often mimicked organic elements. The subtle persuasive rhetoric of written chronicles resulted in savvy targeted marketing campaigns of goods and behaviors. And the stylized visual splendor of the detailed drawing, engraving, and painting of fashion plates fed an aspirational fantasy that ended in consumption. Yet fashion paradoxically excluded many of the women on whom it depended by hiding their labor. Some, however, channeled the feminization of fashion and their own dexterity with the tropes of idealized femininity to forge careers. In other words, we might say that they collaborated with fashion's exclusionary regime to create pathways to professionalization largely unavailable to women in other sectors of the economy. So one of the key themes of the book is the duplicity some 19th century women learned to negotiate in order to become successful professionals, and sometimes simply in order to work. Even as their products were globally disseminated, marketed, and sold, and their lives sensationalized, these women's actual work lives remain obscure. Along with hats and other consumables, divorced from the labor of their creators, the studied leisure of the fashion column that concealed the class and labor of the women who wrote them, and the commoditized fashion plate were all produced through a laborious process that hid the entrepreneurial and artistic identities of their creators. By challenging the monolithic idea that women were primarily fashion's victims, either as brainless consumers or exploited labor, I'm trying to show here how the women I study worked within an oppressive system to forge successful careers. To illuminate a more nuanced picture of these women's extensive contribution, I turn to a variety of documents such as lesser-known literary texts like vaudeville plays, documents such as bankruptcy records and school manuals, press items like faits divers and columns from the women's press, and visual materials like popular prints and preparatory sketches and watercolors by fashion plate artists. I know I zoomed through those, so we can talk about them more in the Q&A. This allowed me to explore not only the representation but also the counter strategies of these working women who produced fashion's fantasy. Working in an active network with each other, they achieved both agency and influence within a cultural system that exploited working class women and largely denied employment opportunities to bourgeois women. And while they made significant professional contributions, their actual work often remained hidden behind eroticizing myths about the working woman and the entrenched and powerful ideals of bourgeois respectability. Although fashion had significant negative impacts on women in the 19th century, as it still does, of course, it also gave some of them opportunities for lives of productive work. And that's the story I wanted to tell in this book. This is my table of contents. And as you can see from the table of contents, there are basically three categories of women workers I deal with. They are makers, writers, and artists. Fashion's makers tended to be working class women whose image and reputation as sexually available social climbers were celebrated in literary and popular culture throughout the 19th century. A visual fantasy world proliferated around modistes. Countless prints and popular literary texts repeat the same trope of the sexy modiste posing more than working, the object of a typically male gaze. She became a stand-in for all of the working women working in the fashion, for all of the urban women working in the fashion industry. Dangerous because she was aiming to seduce a man from a higher class in order to marry up. Modistes were particularly troubling to the social order in this regard because apprentices with enough skill could rise through the ranks and achieve a degree of independence. So I'm arguing that the sexual autonomy emphasized by the print culture surrounding the modiste actually covers for what was perhaps a more disturbing entrepreneurial autonomy. I found counterpoints to all of this visual mythologizing in vaudeville plays, a genre whose audience typically includes modistes themselves and other working women, in faits divers, which sensationalized this figure, and finally in bankruptcy records. And it was really here that I discovered just how entrepreneurial many of these women were, opening businesses, going into partnerships, and often going bankrupt. And while many of the records are quite poignant, recording business failures and other losses, they also point to the scope of the industry and offer a glimpse into a non-mythologized work life. Like their working class counterparts, some bourgeois women, among them journalists and painters, also produced commodities that were essential to the industry, and similarly, they were also both highly visible and curiously obscured. The journalists I study assumed strategically tailored identities and sometimes aristocratic pseudonyms to conceal their working lives behind the leisured fictions of their columns. They were central agents in shaping consumers among the journal's readership, but their agency remained hidden behind a discourse that presented them principally as ladies of leisure. While their rhetorical panache and embellished identities, with their rhetorical panache and embellished identities, it's easy to see why the term modiste would be applied to these so-called modistes des lettres, as they've been called. Finally, the two painters I study, the Collin sisters, Anaïs and Héloïse, were marginalized by mainstream art education and thus turned to a daily grind of commercial art production that paradoxically portrayed idyllic scenarios of women's recreation. I use this painting, which I refer to as a mutual self-portrait, executed together by both sisters, as a jumping-off point to talk about their collaborative artistic practice, which allowed them to represent and catalog women's experience while they simultaneously fed the fashion industry, made art, and earned a living. They signed their works, making their gender apparent and laying claim to their art, and were omnipresent in the domain of fashion publication, sketching and painting on tight weekly deadlines to illustrate the latest fashions and promote shops and styles. In Anaïs's account book, one of the only remaining firsthand traces of the sisters in the archives apart from their artwork, we find a faint note penned on the back of a page that reads, quote, returned 100 francs to Eloise, January 16th, 1845. Likewise, in the columns of the ledger, another reads, quote, on October 7th, received 50 francs for my fashion sketch for Eloise. These traces of monetary and artistic exchange reflect the possibility that the sisters lent each other money and either collaborated on projects or did work for each other, as well as painted side by side, as the self-portrait suggests. Like the chroniqueuses, who disguised their real labor in order to appeal to the leisured aspirations of their readers, and like the modistes, whose eroticized reputations overshadowed their work accomplishments, these fashion illustrators are little known in spite of the pioneering work they did in the fashion industry and the pathways they opened for bourgeois, aspirational, and middle-class women in the workforce. So to finish up, by focusing on the intersection of the culture of fashion and other cultural forms, and by considering the impact of this nexus on the idea of the feminine, Behind the Scenes brings these women and their work out of obscurity and into dialogue with each other, as each group in her own way was deploying similar strategic moves towards similar ends. By looking more closely at what has long been hiding in plain sight, by taking seriously understudied texts and archival documents, and thus exploring this textured history and lineage of women working, my book aims to reframe women's relation to fashion in 19th century France as one not only of passive consumption or exploitation, but also, importantly, of productive agency and self-determination. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you to the organizers, Masha, Rachel and Susan McCready, and Susan Hiner. Thank you so much for doing this conversation with me. I'm really so glad to be here, and I find your book to be, as I find all of your work to be, very inspirational. So thank you for your labor. And actually, I was thinking that maybe I'd start with a little anecdote, la petite histoire. Susan, I hope it's okay. I was thinking that the last time that you and I met up in Paris, not the last time we saw each other, but the last time we saw each other in Paris, you were finishing up this book, and I think it might have been the summer of 2019.
I was not finishing this book in the summer of 2019.
You were working on it. It was before the
I was
pandemic.
finishing it for a long time.
Yeah, well, so you were working at that point on Emmeline Raymond, and we decided we were going to get together, schedules aligned, we were both there at the same time, and I happened to be staying up in a place that I don't normally stay in Paris, at the Place de Clichy, so it's up by the Moulin Rouge, basically, and you said, oh great, let's meet up there, and I thought, okay, and so you came up to Place de Clichy, and we met. And I sort of said, thank you so much for coming up here. It's not so central. We could have found another spot. And you said, no. I want to meet at Place de Clichy because Emmeline Raymond lived around here. And I wanted to do her walking commute, right? To see where she had to walk, weekly to submit her column to her editor, how it was for her to, walk from her home to different boutiques where she had to do her research. And you were going to do that walk. And that's why you went up to the Place de Clichy. And I should mention too, that this was a summer where there was sort of rolling canicule. So I think it was 150 degrees. And there you were walking around. You didn't have the corset and the bustle that Emmeline Raymond probably was wearing.
You didn't have a parasol either.
Or the parasol, yes. But I wanted to mention it because I thought, well, there's an example of sort of hidden labor of, that is embedded in your study and in this book, which has a beautiful, as Masha said, this is a gorgeous book. It's full of illustrations, full colored. It is a really wonderful sort of final product, but it does also obscure, in a sense, the immense amount of work and the different sort of kinds of labor that go into this kind of research, and which relates to the different kinds of labor that you're interested in studying in this book. So with that little anecdote, aside, I did want to talk about labor because to me, this book is at its core about labor and gender, and exploring this kind of history through the hat maker the journalists and the illustrators, which are the ones that you're concentrating on, is such an interesting way for us to sort of reconceptualize what work is and what work was. And so I wondered if you would like to talk a little bit more about what kinds of hidden labor, you touched on it a little bit in your presentation, but what different kinds of hidden labor were sort of obscured that you really wanted to expose and illuminate in your book?
Yeah, oh, I'm so glad you reminded me of that. That was a wonderful anecdote. And yeah, that's true. She did live on the Place de Clichy, and especially during the time of the Commune, when she continued to write, even though her columns were not being published on time. She was somehow having to get to get around and go places. Her publisher, I think, was in the sixth. And so, yeah, you have to think about how she negotiated all of that. And yeah, it was just interesting to see where she had her salon, as it was described. Yeah, so all kinds of different labor. Well, there are three different sort of types of women or it's three different métiers, if you will. And I guess the makers, it's probably a little more obvious to think about what kind of labor they were doing. The women at the top of the atelier, the maîtresse, would be more of an entrepreneur sort of person, and she would have been ordering raw materials. Her première would have been doing design work. And all of the little hands would have been doing what I imagine couldn't have been very pleasant, sort of gluing and sewing and stitching with big heavy needles into hard fabric, and working sometimes with materials that were dangerous. If anyone has read Alison Matthews David's book on fashion victims, she talks about the dangers of certain dyes, of arsenic, the feather workers and the flower workers, and hat makers would certainly have been engaging with those materials all the time. So there's all of that sort of handwork and manual labor that we could think about. But sort of less obvious labor is the labor, say, of the journalists and the artists who were producing these very sort of polished and seemingly unlaborious anecdotes or visual anecdotes of the life of a bourgeois woman. And in particular with the journalists, it was presumably the life that they themselves led, because they were talking, especially in the case of someone like the Vicomtesse de Renneville, but I guess also Gigi, Jeanne-Justine Foucault de Pucy, because they assumed these persona that allowed them to present themselves as sort of moving through high society and inhabiting that world, and just sort of casually describing what they saw. Meanwhile, what they were actually doing was, visiting shops, perhaps attending high society events, but making notes so that they could then package it into a kind of, articles and anecdotes for a reading public. And then, crafting, editing and revising other people's work as well. In the case of the journalists, probably selecting, we don't know for certain, but selecting images that would fashion plates that would accompany the journals, working with advertisers, possibly. And in the case of Emeline Reymond, responding to this just unbelievably voluminous correspondence that she received. And she was very faithful. She responded every week, hundreds and hundreds of responses to this like wacky correspondence that ranged from, any manner of questions. We don't know the questions, we only have the answers. And that in and of itself is a fascinating object of study, in my view. But I should also talk about there's like so there's sort of two layers of the labor that I talk about. And there's this like layers to the hiding as well. There's of course the sort of ideological veil, which is a term I borrow from historian, I believe, whose name is Beatrice Craig, and she talks about ideological veils. And there, the way I use her term is to think about the ideology, the sort of ideology of the bourgeois, the leisured bourgeois woman, that sort of ideology of domesticity and non-working leisure, which really impeded not so much, it impeded bourgeois women from openly avowing that they were working. And in the case of working class women, that the sort of flip side of that ideology would be the over-sexualizing of the working class woman who was sort of social climbing, and she wasn't really working either. She was actually just sleeping around and trying to find a husband and move up the social ladder. So I guess I wanted to get behind those mythologies and look at what were they actually doing, because they were actually doing something, because it's those ideological veils that hide the fact that they actually built the fashion system. It wasn't just Charles Frederick Worth, you know. They were doing it long before he was. I guess I should, one last thing about that to say is that they also did, you know, self-concealing. I mean, it was very important, in fact, and also sort of manipulated these ideologies to their own advantage, so that they could like work within this system and find pathways to professionalism. I think Trish Tilburg does a good job of this in her book about the midinette, talking about how working class women really traded on the mythology of the kind of sexy fashion worker to sort of lend cachet to their products. And you know, by the same token, the journalists in particular, I think it's less clear with the painters, but the journalists were also presenting themselves often as women leading lives that were very, very far removed from the lives they actually would have led, because none of them were bourgeois housewives, not a one. One of them was divorced. One of them had been abandoned by her ne'er-do-well husband, and Emmeline Raymond was never married. Not a domestic goddess.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's one of the, what you were just talking about is one of the really interesting tensions that you sort of delve into in your book, with this sort of the fact that some of these women, that the writers, especially, and sort of the illustrators as well, were in a sense complicit with, you know, creating this sort of seamless, beautiful exterior kind of whether it be a persona for themselves or illustrations of the fashion industry. But your book really also delves into the fact that, you know, behind the scenes, that didn't necessarily correspond to their lived realities, but these were strategies for them to actually make a living in the fashion industry. So I think that's one of the major contributions of this book, actually. So thank you so much. I wanted to go back to an archival question, because that was another thing that I found really fascinating about your book, is the different kinds of, I thought, somewhat unusual archives that you were able to access and sort of make sense of within the broader story of the fashion industry. And so one of these sets of archives was the bankruptcy records that you were able to decipher for us. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that experience of working with those archives and sort of what you discovered.
Yeah, sure. Actually, this gives me the opportunity to give a huge shout out to an early career scholar, a historian, John Finkelberg, who is fantastic. And I heard him give a talk at the NCFS that you hosted, Heidi. And he gave a talk on tailors. And, you know, I had been really struggling with this question of that I kept getting whenever I talked about, I was working on the modiste at the time. I kept getting this question every time I talked about them. Yeah, but who were they? Who were they? Who were they really? And I didn't know. I mean, I am a literary person at heart, and I was, I sort of go into visual representation too, but I'm really interested in the representation of these women. That's what I had been focusing on. But everybody wanted to know who they really were. So, I mean, I'm glad they asked that question, because it forced me to go, like, to take to add another dimension to the work I was doing in that chapter. And I heard John's talk, and he was talking about, I mean, he had gone into he talked about these bankruptcy archives. So of course, I just pounced on him after the panel, and he was so kind, and he not only told me where to go, but he explained to me, it's one of those, just, it's the let's see, the Archives de la Ville de Paris, and it's at the Porte de Lilas, and it's in this cinder block building, and it's very sort of depressing, and it's sort of this stereotype of the labyrinthine library archival process in France. But he helped me figure out how to actually get at some of these things. And so I have him to thank for pointing me there. I went back to that library 2 or 3 times, and I looked through, hundreds and hundreds. There are just so many of these records, and they were really hard to make sense of at first. First of all, the handwriting is nearly indecipherable. Some of them I just couldn't read. But I just took a lot of pictures, and then once I had more time, I came back and sort of pored over them, and then you can sort of start to tease out the story for me, from the inventory. That's where I was able to, you get a little, each of these, there's sort of a formula for the documents. There's sort of a just the facts sort of history, where they were born, what the marital history, this sort of thing. The 3, it's not 3 women, but the three examples that I give are women, each of whom comes from sort of a different starting. They enter the profession from a different starting point. And one of them was had been married, and when was left by her husband, who stole all of her money, and she was actually someone of means. Another was a pair of sisters, and I forget honestly who the last one was, but I chose those examples because they illustrated in different ways the fact that they provided counterpoints to this mythology, and that's what I was looking for. I was looking for ways to puncture the mythology, because the vaudeville plays only get you so far. Because they always sort of revert to the all's well that ends well, and we're all kind of happy, and we're going back into our stereotyped roles. I also looked at faits divers, which were fascinating, and what a rabbit hole that was. This was COVID times, and I had just discovered Retro News, which I highly recommend if you have time. What was so great about digging around in Retro News was, the digitized page. On the digitized page, you see the faits divers, which are these sensationalized stories, and they're very in the same sort of mode as vaudeville and honestly the popular prints, very sort of sensational, but tending towards the tragic, and the lovelorn modiste who throws herself down a well, and things like that. Those stories would appear on the same page as these little brief announcements of business openings, or bankruptcies, or marriages. And many of the marriages were modiste marrying this or that artisan, just very, very dry, just the facts. They were married, they live on this street, and that was that. And it was just such an interesting juxtaposition to see the sort of mythologized version and the more factual, real version on the same page, coexisting. And I think you don't necessarily see that unless you look at the actual facsimile, and you can actually see where, so yeah, I mean, those are some of the things that happened in terms of the bankruptcy records. I think were particularly valuable. And I that there's just a huge trove. There's lots of work to be done with archives like that. If you can strain your eyes and try to understand them. And, you know, I'm not a trained historian, so really I'm sort of faking it. And that's why John was so helpful to me. And yeah, it presented all kinds of challenges, but you know, you can find a big payoff in a very, very tiny little detail.
Yeah, and I really love what you do with that, with the bankruptcy records themselves, to sort of say, well, there are a lot of bankruptcy records, and one could read these as, you know, failures, right? Because they're bankruptcies, but one can also see them as examples and evidence that women were entering the workforce, that women were being entrepreneurs.
Oh, yeah.
And so, you know, and then to show how, you know, the complexities of women's experience all on the same page being, you know, being exhibited all on the same page is,
You know, yeah, it's funny you say that, because I always think of it, the analogy I always make is that it's like the New York City restaurant business, you know, the constant failure, but you know, it's there's always a good restaurant, and it's you can, you know, it's a booming industry. So I think it's something similar to that. There were loads and loads of modiste shops throughout the 19th century, in particular during the Second Empire. Yeah.
yeah.
And after. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wondered if we could talk a little bit about the Collin sisters, Collin
Mhm.
sisters, who are so fascinating. And, you know, there's this is another, I think, major contribution of your book, because you really delve into them and their work as artists, but also their work as fashion illustrators, and you sort of show how these two are related. So I wondered if you could just speak a little bit more about them, and specifically, I'm thinking about you know, there has been work done on them, on fashion illustrators, by Sharon Marcus, by Valerie
Yes.
Steele, and others.
By you.
By me. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about them, and about what sort of part of the story that hadn't been told yet you wanted to explore.
Yeah. Well, I just huge shout out to you, Heidi, and also to Valerie, and of course Sharon Marcus, who wrote that brilliant article that became a chapter in Between Women. Yeah, all of those, all of that scholarship laid the groundwork and really just piqued my interest. Just made me want to go further into these fashion plates, which, you know, can sometimes just seem so flat and static and uninteresting and silly, and yet women were fascinated by them in the 19th century, such that they became commodities in and of themselves. They were separated from the journals in which they appeared regularly. And this is why you can't always find the illustration attached, you know, inserted in the correct. It's hard to track down the right image. It's great when you can find it, but you can't always find it. And you know, you go to people's houses, and well, I do, and you see you see old people's houses, and you see fashion prints from the 19th century like on the walls. They were commodities in that sense, and they also, I have this image in my book of one of those sort of 3D embellished fashion plates. That was also something that was like sort of a popular activity. And I first learned about those because Benedict Monica sent me a picture of one and said, "What is this?" And I was like, I don't know. Let me see if I can find out. And it turns out it was a whole thing. Literally attaching scraps of fabric onto a fashion plate, and sort of in this palimpsestic way, entering the consumer is now entering into the creation too of layering of this sort of creative work. So there was work done on them, and they were fascinating to me. I should also say that I think a lot of the work that was done on women artists, like, I mean, Alex Wethofer and other people in the world of art history, of course, who, starting with Linda Nochlin, of course, you know, have obviously been thinking about, you know, women artists. This is a little different because they weren't they were commercial artists, and I guess part of what I wanted to do here was to celebrate that, not to say, you know, they're somehow diminished because they were not artists, which one could argue they were. They had a lot of training. They showed in the salons. They were dismissed in much the same way many women artists were dismissed in the 19th century, you know, not admitted to Beaux-Arts, etc. But what they did is they decided to use their talents in order to make a living, which they needed to do. One of them was widowed at a very young age. Anaïs, she had 3 children. She was widowed and needed to support herself. So, and then that's kind of the story that you hear, that you glean anyway from the journalists as well. I mean, I like to think they wanted to work as well, but who can know? So, well, I guess some of the things I wanted to focus on here was just I wanted to really tell a story, and I started with that self-portrait, and the more I studied that self-portrait, I started to think about like a through line from the self-portrait through the fashion plates, and thinking about the miniature art, which most, well, many women who were artistically inclined in the 19th century would have practiced watercolor and miniature art. And Héloïse and Anaïs, and they had another sister, Laure, who was, as you know, Heidi, who was, I think there was a 4th sister, but she wasn't an artist at all. But Laure was a fashion plate artist as well, but she, we don't have much of her remaining artwork, and I don't know why, maybe you do, but she wasn't as imbricated in this collaboration as Héloïse and Anaïs were. So yeah, I felt like they were sort of modeling for me anyway, this collaborative community of women style of creation and art production that was very much at odds with the sort of like, you know, great artist, genius male painter. And it just, I found it fascinating. And so I wanted to tease out that story, and that's what I was trying to do. There was also, you know, I stumbled on a master's thesis by someone called Marie Bonin, who I think was doing a master's in art history, and she worked on the Collin sisters, and that's how I discovered the ledger. But it took me a while to find it, me and my lousy archival skills, but I eventually found it, and then I was just, again, it was one of these like mysterious documents. Well, what do I do with this? It's just a list. But you know, the more you look at it, and then it was hard to read, of course. But I noticed Héloïse's name. And so it occurred to me that there was something going on there, some kind of collaborative work that was being signaled by that, by the mention of her name. I guess the other thing that I think I really wanted to get into was the process, again, back to the work, the process of what it would have been to produce weekly 1 or 2 or perhaps more of these beautiful, you know, very nuanced, delicate. The watercolors are quite stunning, and they're housed in an archive that's run by the Galliera, and I don't remember exactly where it is. It's on the right bank somewhere, but they're very small, and as are the little drawings, with all the little notations. And so I guess, you know, I was interested in sort of thinking through what the process was and what the implied labor would be. And they too, like the journalists, would have been moving around, circulating around the city, from studio home to shops, to draw things, to talk to people, to figure out what they were going to the press, this and that. So, you know, this idea that well, I mean, it's been debunked before now, but that bourgeois women were sitting at home doing their embroidery, and didn't dare venture onto the streets. You know, this is something that stories like these call that into question. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I think you and I could talk about this for hours and hours,
Yeah.
but I do see the chat is lighting up, and so I'm going to turn to a few questions that people in the room are asking. So Justine de Young has asked a question about, and I think it's related to Emmeline Raymond,
Mm.
about her circumstances, her work circumstances, and Justine wonders about whether she couldn't have just mailed her articles. So maybe that's a postal history question, but maybe you know
Yeah.
something about that.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe she did. Maybe she could have. It's possible. I really couldn't say. I mean, I don't have evidence that she had to walk around. That may just be my imagination running away with me. Um, Probably in the heat of the commune, she wasn't like walking over to the sixth arrondissement. But um, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know how things. Maybe she had a delivery service. I mean, and it's possible. It's possible. But I do imagine that she had to get out and about in order to see what she needed to see.
Mhm.
And I also imagine that she must have needed to have meetings with other editors at the press and printers and things like that. Just there was a lot of sort of executive function that would have been required. So even if she wasn't moving around, she was working a lot.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But
Yeah.
that's one of those questions. It's like, yeah, I would love to know more.
Mhm. 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 Yeah. We have a question from Nicholas Walters, who's asking about, I guess, some antecedents. 18th century, whether your research was involved the 18th century as well. And he's working on 18th and 19th century Spain and Portugal.
Oh.
And so wonders if you if your research has aligned with any of these areas or time
Um,
periods.
well, I not really. I really can't say that it is, and I wouldn't claim to have much knowledge in that regard. Although I was very much helped by the work of Jennifer Jones and Claire Haru Crouston and the Fabricating Women, the book about the seamstresses. And I'm sure there's some others that I'm forgetting. Just really great historians who did so much important work, and 18th century scholars, who worked on that, on the women who were like the couturières, the seamstresses, and the guilds, and all of that sort of back history that really is part of the story of the modiste who emerges out of that seamstress guild. And without knowing how that worked, it's hard to understand how they were making a break. I mean, they broke away from the seamstresses and had a higher status than the seamstresses. And had more freedom.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't have more to add. I wish I
No,
did. There are
it's
probably
a
some people in
subject.
the crowd though who
Mhm.
know more about the 18th century than I do.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. There's a question from Sun Young Park, who is asking about school manuals, whether you worked with those, and is wondering about how those might have fit into your analysis.
Yeah, yeah. I actually only used one in my book, and I did use it. Um, there's probably a lot more that could be done with that type of resource. The one I worked on or worked with, I used it in my chapter. I think I actually used it in my first chapter, which is really sort of an overview chapter, but it was in thinking about the figure of the modiste and becoming a woman, a fashion worker. And the school manual is, I just gave a talk about this at the 19th Century French Studies Conference. The manual is called Tu seras ouvrière. And it's just a really weird book. It was part of a series which had this pedagogical idea that the lessons would be embedded in this kind of fictional narrative of a character with whom the pupils would presumably identify. And so the Tu seras ouvrière, and the title is just kind of horrifying, but you know, that school manual tells the story of a seamstress modiste who, you know, against all odds, makes it in Paris, owns her own like huge department store. I mean, she's Denise Baudu, in school manual form. And yeah, so I mean that's one such text, but I didn't make I am certain that there must be a lot of things out there that one could look at. I barely scratched the surface there.
Mhm.
It's a great idea though. It's a great topic.
Yeah, that is a really interesting. I remember your talk, and I remember this section in the book. It really is a fascinating and very strange, you know, prescriptive kind of example. So there are a couple of questions about sort of women working together. So one is from Seema Godfrey, who knows much about fashion, of course. So Seema asks, given the various intricate specialties, did any women work in small collectives, such as 2 or 3 together?
Hmm. I believe that they did, but I think there were lots of different models, and it's not something that probably something I should have studied more, tried to figure out. I imagine that they did, but if I think about a modiste shop, I think typically my understanding from what I have researched is that the materials would be purchased from other suppliers. And so the feathers would already be treated, and they would be purchased from the plumassier, the plumassière. The artificial flowers would come from fleuristes who would have their own workshop. And the hat forms would also be purchased from whoever made the hat forms. Straw, some people would be working in straw. There were other materials, and then fabrics and things like that. Ribbons. There was a ribbon industry, and so all of these industries would feed. I think it's entirely possible that an atelier would be working with other skilled workers in one space. I think that's possible. But in the atelier, there would be a group of, as Heidi, I know you know this, there would be a group of petites mains working on, you know, whatever the première decided was going to be created. So there was a hierarchy within the atelier. So there was a group, it was a group of women working together, and it was very hierarchical. But it was also, there was the possibility of movement. So the première could have started as a trottin, a delivery girl, and eventually showing promise and learning could make her way up. So in that sense, it was sort of, I guess, sort of a meritocracy. And could eventually be given the shop. The shop could be bequeathed to her or sold to her by the maîtresse when she retires.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just another example too of sort of how women sort of made it happen, forged careers for themselves. You know, sort of sometimes starting at the bottom of the hierarchy, but moving their way up. There's another question about working together or collaboration, and it relates to the wearer's participation or possible participation in the fabrication of something. So it's a question from Susan Siegfried, who asks about, did you find any evidence of wearers, women or men, participating in the design and fabrication of their clothes, beginning with the selection of fabrics or colors?
Well, I think in higher end establishments, that would probably have been the case. You know, I can't say with any certainty, so I don't want to lay claim to things. And of course, my go-to reference is Zola, which is a bad, you know, you can't rely on fiction. But of course, what's her name? Henriette, was that her name? Madame Desforges. She had a lot to say in what she was going to be wearing, but that was a department store, and so not exactly the same thing. Yeah, I think my educated guess is that yes, in certain kinds of establishments, there would definitely have been that. And also, of course, the fashion plates and the patterns and things that you would find in the journals could have been intended for seamstresses and modistes, but also for consumers, and consumers in, say, think Madame Bovary could have taken a fashion plate to, although, who knows how she would have done this in, Yonville, but a provincial woman could take a fashion plate to her seamstress and say, here's what I would like. And here, so in that sense, yes, absolutely. And I think the fashion journals were designed with that in mind, because you have detailed descriptions of what types of fabrics each illustration is using, and why would you need to know exactly what the type of fabric it is? Why would you need to know? Well, the seamstress might need to know, or the consumer might want to know, if the consumer is going to take it to her seamstress and have it made. So I don't know if that answered that question at all, but it meandered off into something.
Yeah, no, it's a question remaining for us to delve more into, I think. And so I do see I'm keeping my eye on the time, and I find we've come to the end of our time. But I did want to mention that Marnie Kessler has asked a very compelling and important question about thinking about the possible colonial roots of some of the fabrics and materials that were part of the fashion system. And that is, I think, a whole other session. I don't know if you want to.
I just want to say that this is actually something that I'm fascinated by, of course. And I have started doing some research myself. I mean, that's something that I'm hoping to pursue in a future project. I've been looking into indigo a little bit, and of course cotton, which is all over the novels. And it's all that hiding in plain sight kind of stuff. And there would be no fashion without colonialism. So that's the starting point for me.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you so much, Susan and Heidi, for this amazing discussion that's been so just stimulating and interesting and just all around fascinating. And I hope that we can continue the conversation in the future. And we come to the end of the formal part of the program, but please feel free to unmute yourselves, turn on your cameras, and stay to chat for a few minutes if you'd like. And otherwise, please join me in thanking Susan and Heidi for this really fascinating discussion.